Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Well, today I have a very overdue used book haul to share with you. Some of these books are from little free libraries, some are from a book sale at a large branch of my county library, and many of them are from the amazing Brattle bookshop in Boston. Now, don't get too excited. My trip to the Brattle was in probably August of last year. For almost an entire year, I've stored these books in a cardboard box in my study, occasionally pulling them out and poking through them, and then replacing whichever ones I've read, so I'd be able to make this video. I'm not absolutely certain which books came from the Brattle versus other sites. And let me warn you in advance that this is, in general, a pretty nerdy collection of books today. So let's get started going through this huge pile. Actually, I want to start with a book I recently bought new. The 2023 book, The Dictionary People, The Unsung Heroes Who Created the Oxford English Dictionary by Sarah Ogilvie. I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with the Oxford English Dictionary, a dictionary so large that it looks more like a set of encyclopedias if you line up the full-sized editions in a bookcase. If you have the 2-volume home version, it comes with a magnifying glass. We used to joke that it came with its own microscope. Anyway, at my local library, the volumes were stored on the bottom shelf, and I used to sit on the floor and poke through them. Back in the day, before home computers and especially before cell phones, people used to rely on one-volume dictionaries, but the OED was different, with a kind of depth about the usage of language across time that can make it compulsive reading. You might be trying to look up one particular word, but you could easily get distracted as you flip through the pages trying to find the word you were initially looking for. This book is an account, a, quote, thrilling literary detective story, as the jacket copy says, of the dictionary's origins. The reviews are amazing and come from not just academic circles, but from people like Jeanette Winterson and Jamaica Kincaid. Perhaps I will put this on my nonfiction November TBR. I mentioned this new book mostly because it was inspired by a book I found at a local little free library, Reading the OED, One Man, 1 Year, 23,730 pages by Eamon Shea, published in 2008. Shea says at the beginning of the book, "I've read the OED, so you don't have to." And the back cover tells us that the book is a hair-pulling, eye-crossing account of reading every word and revealing the most obscure, hilarious, oddly useful, and exquisitely useless gems he discovers along the way. This sounds like it will be a wonderful book to pair with Dictionary People. Well, here's another one I found recently in a little free library. It's a classic novel that I'm sure many of you have read, but I have not. It is Stephen Crane's The Red Badge of Courage, and the edition is a golden illustrated classic with lovely artwork inside. Let me find one. This is the story of a young man fighting in the Union Army during the American Civil War. When he's afraid, he flees from battle. And he was ashamed of his cowardice. Circumstances make him understand that a bloody wound, that is, a red badge of courage, would prove that he was brave. I gather that American students who did not grow up in one of the former Confederate states all read this book in junior high school. I will be a latecomer. I really should keep my mouth shut here, but I'm going to share that years ago, when my spouse spilled a bit of our spicy Indian dinner on his white shirt, I referred to the resulting stain as the red badge of curry. Okay, another book from a little free library, Anne of Manhattan by Brina Starler. This romance novel is a modern adaptation of Ellen Montgomery's Anne of Green Gables. Let me read the back cover to you. After an idyllic girlhood in Avonlea, Long Island, Anne has packed her trunk and said goodbye to her foster parents, Marilla and Matthew, and moved to the Isle of Manhattan for grad school. Together with her best friend Diana Barry, she's ready to take on the world and find her voice as a writer. But her longtime arch rival, Gilbert Blythe, shows up to Redmond College for their final year. Anne gets the shock of her life. Gil has been in California for the last 5 years, since he kissed her during a beach bonfire and she ghosted him. Now the handsome man is flashing his dimples at her like he hasn't a care in the world, and she isn't buying it. It goes on. Paired with the same professor for their theses, these two competitors come to a grudging peace that turns into something so much deeper and sexier than either intended. But when Gil seemingly betrays her to get ahead, Anne realizes she was right all along. She should never have trusted Gilbert Blythe. While Gil must prove to Anne that they're meant to be together, she must come to terms with her old fears if she wants a happily ever after with the boy she's always secretly loved. Sounds like quite a diversion for a hot summer day. In my last video, I mentioned another mashup of a romance campus novel and retelling of a classic, and this might be an interesting pair for it. Okay, here's one that I'm pretty sure I found at the Brattle bookshop in Boston. Mary McCarthy's book, How I Grew. This is McCarthy's memoir of her time in high school and college. That is from age 13 until she was 21 or so. And here she recounts both her emotional development as well as her intellectual development, which she traces partly through books, from children's books to classic literature. The jacket flap assures me that this book is, quote, touched by sentiment, but devoid of sentimentality. That sounds like a perfect combination for me. If you're not familiar with Mary McCarthy, she was a 20th century American novelist and critic. And her novel, The Group, about a cohort of brilliant women coming of age between the two world wars, is perhaps her most famous novel. I haven't read it in years, and I really need to put it on the reread pile sometime very soon. I've been thinking about McCarthy a lot lately, especially after I read and reviewed the new nonfiction work, Write Like a Man, Jewish Masculinity and the New York Intellectuals by Ronnie A. Jackson, in which McCarthy features fairly prominently. I'll leave a link to my discussion of the book, which was published on Open Letters Review fairly recently. Booktubers put 2 more books about Mary McCarthy on my search for list, and I've been lucky enough to find both of them in the last few months. First is Seeing Mary Plain, A Life of Mary McCarthy by Frances Kiernan. I have only peeked at this one so far, but it looks fascinating, not only because of its subject, but because it interweaves all these snippets from interviews inserted in fairly large chunks. So all of McCarthy's old friends and enemies, etc., get to speak on the page and have their say. The clips are not all from interviews. A few are from written sources produced and printed by other people as well. That is certainly not the typical way biographies are written, but somehow thinking about how a wide range of people saw and interacted with and spoke about McCarthy seems especially right, since she was part of a literary community. And the other McCarthy book I found was one highly recommended by Steve Donahue, Between Friends, The Correspondence of Hannah Arendt and Mary McCarthy, 1949 to 1975, edited by Carol Brightman. I am especially eager to read this volume soon, since I have long been intrigued by Hannah Arendt, who I sometimes have joked was my namesake. The jacket copy says this: Arendt's letters bring her gruff, tender voice and keen intelligence to life on the page, even as they traded ideas about politics, literature, and morality. They also shared personal advice and delightful gossip. Another book I picked up at the Brattle is sort of related to the McCarthy-Arendt letters. It's called A Common Life, 4 Generations of American Literary Friendships and Influence. The book traces 4 sets of friends, all of whom were authors vitally important to American literature. Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville in the 19th century in New England, Henry James and Edith Wharton at the beginning of the 20th century in New York, Catherine Porter and Eudora Welty in the 20th century South, and Elizabeth Bishop and Robert Lowell as we head north again. Stowed away in the opening pages are publicity materials, including a blurb from Fay Weldon, who I mentioned in my last video. At a little free library in Boston, not terribly far from the Brattle, I picked up 2 books about Cape Cod. The Cape, as it's frequently called, is quite close to Boston, but I've never been there. My family is from the coast of South Carolina, and I now live fairly near the beaches of the mid-Atlantic, in Maryland, but also Delaware and Virginia. But every time I read about the New England coast, I want to visit. One of the books I found is Henry Beston's The Outermost House, A Year of Life on the Great Beach of Cape Cod, one of Steve Donahue's very favorites, if I remember correctly. The other is The Salt House, A Summer on the Dunes of Cape Cod by the author Cynthia Huntington. Both look really wonderful, and they made me think about another writer, one who's written what I think is a somewhat similar book, but about a beach I actually do know well in Delaware. That book, which I was thrilled to find at a used book sale near my home in the Washington, D.C. area, was written by Jennifer Ackerman, who's been getting a lot of attention lately for a new book of hers. But this one was written back in 1995. Which wildly is almost 30 years ago. Did I do my math right there? Surely not. Anyway, although the title is now Birds of the Shore, the book is about much more than just birds. It's about all natural life along the shore and the movement of sand and surf, as the back cover proclaims. It's also about Ackerman's life there, including the ill health of family members she loves and her desire to start a new generation. Actually, let me read the last line of the jacket copy. With a quiet passion and friendly, generous intelligence, Birds by the Shore explores the way that landscape shapes our thoughts and perceptions and shows that home ground is often where we feel the deepest response to the planet. Okay, on to some more books by and about women writers from earlier decades. Perhaps my favorite thing to read. Let me talk for a minute about this general subject, actually, for a minute. I'm quite interested in authors from the U.S., especially during the early to mid parts of the 20th century. Sometimes I think about this little obsession of mine as ridiculously niche, but then I think about how incredibly popular similar British authors have become again recently. Books put out by both the sort of highbrow press Persephone, the terrifically named furrowed middlebrow imprint of Dean Street Press, and even the more established Virago, are all rediscovering wonderful women writers, mostly from Britain, and their books seem to be selling quite well. So let me mention a whole set of American women writers who are very much the equivalents. First, let me talk about Susan Glaspell. She is not well read these days in general, other than her short story, A Jury of Her Peers, which is often considered an early feminist text. This book is one I bought new, I think, when it was republished a decade or more ago. In addition to these short stories, she was a well-regarded playwright back in the day, and even won a Pulitzer Prize. In my jaunts about town, I found 2 books about Glaspell, both library discards. One is by Barbara Azablo and is called Susan Glaspell, A Critical Biography, published in 2000 by the University of North Carolina Press. For those of you who don't know, the University of North Carolina Press is one of my favorites, especially because UNC published my own book. The other book is called Susan Glaspell, Her Life and Times, and was written by Linda Binsby. I gather this work, published in 2005 by Oxford University Press, emphasizes how her plays and her life as a rebel pointed to major social changes around gender during the first part of the 20th century. Another author who was quite important to American literature in the first half of the 20th century, but who seems to have been almost forgotten more recently, is Dorothy Canfield. Aside from Understood Betsy, which I still do occasionally run across in the children's section of my library, I was quite pleased to pick up this Virago Modern Classic edition of her novel The Brimming Cup, about a woman who's beginning to rethink what she wants in her life and in her marriage. It's been a while since I've read Canfield, but I also recommend her novels Hillsborough People and Rough Hewn as well. And soon after I found The Brimming Cup, I was thrilled to see this book at the Brattle, Keeping Fires Night and Day, Selected Letters of Dorothy Canfield Fisher, edited by Mark Madigan, with an introduction by Clifton Fadiman. I'll talk more about Fadiman at some future date, but he's kind of a favorite of mine. Anyway, the letter collection contains Canfield's correspondence with not only her friend Willa Cather, but W.E.B. Du Bois, Albert Einstein, Robert Frost, Margaret Mead, etc. One more biography I found at the Brattle about an American woman author, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a biography by Cynthia J. Davis, published by Stanford in 2010, and written by a professor from the University of South Carolina. Like Glaspell, she has remained on reading list because of one story, a story even better known than a jury of her peers, I think, and that is The Yellow Wallpaper, which was published in 1890. Gilman wrote several novels, as well as quite a bit of nonfiction. Back when I was 22 or so, I read her short novel Herland, which is sort of a feminist utopian novel where women have all the power in society, and they use that power to create a relatively egalitarian and peaceful world. I say that women have all the power in society, but that doesn't mean they are exerting power over the men in their society. Herland had no men, so women served all the roles in the culture, including roles that only men were expected to hold in the real American society of the time. Gilman wrote in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and many people are still a bit stunned by how radical some of her ideas were about everything from the social construction of gender to the evils of the financial subordination and sexual abuse of women that marriage effectively sanctioned then. People are also stunned by views that are abhorrent to most of us now, saying, for example, that Black Americans were, quote, wildly dissimilar and in many respects inferior, and supporting so-called social Darwinism and eugenics. Despite her racism, Gilman argued that slavery was the cause of this supposed inferiority, and white people were not only to blame, but were morally required to try to remedy the damages that had been done. Gilman was also a widely known and highly influential social activist, not surprisingly given her views, sometimes considered, quote, the brains of the U.S. women's movement, and the person who tried to broaden it from a quest for suffrage to a fight for social and economic equality. All in all, she is quite a subject for a biography, and from what I hear, this one is really a corker. Okay, that is it for this huge book haul. I have, of course, acquired other books throughout the year, but many of them were either sent to me by publishers in hopes that I might write a review for publication, or already read and returned to local little free libraries. And, of course, I borrow books from my regular county library quite regularly as well, both print and digital books. Still, I feel like once I go through a haul like this on my channel, it surely must be time to go use book shopping again, right? Right? Well, thank you for joining me for this little nearly year-long fiasco today. See you again soon here on Hannah's Books.